Hello everyone, and welcome to the 9th episode of Viral Banter, the Generation Liberty forum show. This is our 9th episode, which is pretty exciting because we're pretty close to 10, which will make us double digits finally. And on today, I have, once again, 4 amazing guests. But as you well know, it has been a very sad and scary week in the news. And I think especially for a lot of young people, it's really scary to watch this unfold on the news and not really know what's going on. So perhaps this is going to be a bit more of a serious episode. But I think at Viral Banter, we really believe that we should have more conversations about this and that we can disagree and still get along and still have a civil discussion. So I think that's what this episode is really going to be about. But first up, let's welcome our guests because we're really, really lucky to have them here today. So first off, I'd like to welcome a familiar face to the show, Anjali from the University of Macquarie.
Hey Renee, doing well, good to be back.
Lovely to see you again. And next up, we have our campus coordinator at the finest education provider in Australia, that's Campion College, and this is Criostoir.
Hi Renee, thanks for having me. Great to be back.
Great to have you on the show again. And our next guest is one of the newest members of the research team at the Institute of Public Affairs. She's already making a massive impact. Please welcome Dara Macdonald from the IPA research team.
Great to be back again.
And as our last guest on the show, we are so absolutely lucky to have our first international guest on Viral Banter. He used to actually be based in Australia, but his amazing talent meant that he was snapped up by the talent scouts at the Reason Foundation. So please welcome a good friend of the show and a good friend of mine, Satyajeet Marar, who is a policy analyst at the Reason Foundation in Washington, DC.
Hey, good to be here.
Satya, you are living and working in DC, so I think we'll just address the elephant in the room, that you can give us kind of that perspective from living there, but also I just want you to briefly explain who the Reason Foundation is and why you moved to DC.
Yeah, sure. So the Reason Foundation is the second biggest free market think tank in the United States. We do a lot of research in many different policy areas, ranging from drug policy to energy to education and healthcare. Most of what I do focuses on reforming America's school system so that public school kids get funded fairly, and all those public dollars are being used effectively and not going towards rent seeking or special interests. I love what I do because we work across the aisle. We work with anyone, whether they're Republicans or Democrats, and we equally call them out when they're not doing the right thing. And I think in this era, when you have a lot of partisan politics and people are getting polarized and ideological about it, having evidence-based solutions is absolutely the right way forward.
Oh, I think that is really, really important work that you are doing, and I'm really proud that you are doing that work in America now. But now, as we all know, on May 25th, George Floyd died under police custody. We have all seen the footage, and it's really difficult to watch, and it is an absolute tragedy, and by all rights, he should be alive today. But his death has sparked a series of legitimate protests, as we all know, but also there has been widespread rioting, looting, in many states across America. First off, Satya, can you tell us what your experience has been like living in DC while this is all happening?
Yeah, sure. So the last week has been a bit insane, and it's kind of sad because just at the end of last week, they finally allowed restaurants and small businesses to open up again and have about 10 people, and now the situation has flared up. And it's, I was at the protests on the Sunday and the Saturday night, this is before they started bringing in a ton of National Guard people in, and things got quite out of hand. But I want to stress this fact: for most of the day on both those days, when things got hectic in the end, vast majority of people were completely peaceful, were out there for a good cause. Police brutality is an issue that affects everyone, but especially people in marginalized communities where the police force use excessive force or they target people often for victimless crimes, and there's an overrepresentation of certain groups in custody and incarceration. And as we know, George Floyd was a name on a very long list of African Americans and Americans of other backgrounds who've been unfairly targeted and or killed by the police. So I do want to stress this point that while there are opportunistic looters who've set things on fire, I've seen it personally. I've seen buildings being broken into in front of me. I've seen pharmacies being ransacked and things being set ablaze. A vast majority of people are completely peaceful and are doing this for the right reason. And no matter what you guys are watching on TV there in Australia, it's important to remember that.
I think that's some really, really important points you make there. And also this conflation of groups is what making this really, really confusing, especially from someone watching from overseas. But I've also asked Anjali and Criostoir to prepare some questions for you, Satya, because I think there's a lot of young people in Australia who want to ask people like you who are there what's going on. So I'll pass it off to Anjali for her question.
So Satya, I've noticed a sentiment that's actually becoming popular on social media that suggests that you should either be willing to forgive or overlook the rioting, or then you're really not with the protesters. So based on your experiences of being in DC at the moment and having a better idea of community sentiment, do you feel that the looting and property damage advances the protesters' goals, or if the violence could backfire and move the public against the protests?
Look, the first point to make is that social media is not reality. A lot of the people on there, especially with the blue ticks, live in a complete bubble, which is completely disconnected from reality. And you can see that in the fact that these little chirping heads have been completely unable to predict any election outcomes, and they've really had little to no influence outside of their own platforms. I think that's where it comes from. A vast majority of good, ordinary people sympathize completely with the protesters about the death of George Floyd, are very concerned about keeping the police forces accountable, but also absolutely abhor, looting, rioting, and that sort of thing. And there's two simple rules for this. Don't abuse your power and don't steal people's stuff. It really is quite simple. I do fear actually that, a combination of the people who are engaging in looting and arson and things like that, alongside a lot of the media emphasis being on that minority of people, whether they're opportunistic thieves or whether they're domestic terrorists or political activists from the far left and the far right both. I do worry that it could have the effect of making people lose their sympathy for what is a very important cause. We need to see reform in this country so that the people who protect and serve, or are meant to protect and serve, can be held to account.
Yeah, kind of leading on from that, Satya, because I think you've made some really important points. Whilst watching all this, I was watching kind of traditional media coverage and going through the channels, and I saw a lot of, especially American coverage, saying that America is divided over the death of George Floyd. But do you really think that the American people are divided about that? I would think that a vast majority of Americans would be in agreement that what happened to George Floyd was a horrific injustice.
Yeah, look, for a long time, there was a lot of tension between the, hashtag Black Lives Matter activists and the hashtag Blue Lives Matter defenders of the police. But what's really interesting about this one case is that every single person I've met, spoken to, or even seen on social media, even if they're people who have a ton of police in their family, even if they're police officers themselves, there is unanimous agreement that what happened on that video was absolutely horrible, and that the people who murdered this man, whether they're police or not, deserve to be brought to justice. The only divisions right now are about the way the protests are going. There are different perceptions ranging from whether they are largely peaceful, which they are from what I've seen, to presenting them as being mainly instances of rioting, looting, and chaos. But I think the last few days, with things slowly simmering down, in most cities around this country, we've seen the protests get increasingly peaceful and not go the other direction. In places like Tennessee and places like New Jersey, we've seen National Guardsmen and policemen laying down their weapons and standing in solidarity with the protesters. Because if you're a policeman and your job is to protect people, you can only do your job effectively if you have the trust and the goodwill of that community. And I think things are going in a positive direction.
Well, that is actually really, really good to hear. But I'll also bounce off to Criostoir. I think you have some questions also that you want to ask Satya about what's going on.
Yeah, Satya, I'm kind of leaning on from what Anjali was talking about earlier. I've seen a sort of like a sort of mass confusion on like social media with people sort of confiscating terms and like equating like sort of violence as part of the protests, and sort of like there is no sort of real distinction. I suppose I just wanted to ask, what is the distinction between like riots and protests? And furthermore, what are your thoughts on Trump threatening to bring in the military into states that are not brought under control?
Yeah, sure. Look, I would say that there's three types of acts because it is a very fine line between the two things, unfortunately. Firstly, you have a completely peaceful protest where people are really just chanting and being loud. Secondly, you have a situation where you might have some destruction of public property, whether that was burning down the precinct in Minneapolis where the killing happened, or whether that's setting a bunch of twigs on fire in the middle of the street to start an impromptu bonfire, or even throwing, some kids that I've seen personally throwing plastic bottles and things at the cops. That's sort of, low order destructive behavior. And finally, you have the actual destruction of private property, breaking into people's businesses, looting them, assaulting people, innocent people, and so on. And, I think everyone can sort of agree that the first category is completely permissible and political expression. The final category, I think most people who are decent would agree, is completely unjustified. Those innocent people don't deserve any of the anger for what the police may or may not have done. But really, I guess the gray line is that middle category, right? Because my gut instinct is to say that destroying even public property is wrong. That being said, we've seen what the people of Hong Kong have done, right? They've lashed out at the oppressive regime of the Communist Party in China by destroying public property as part of doing that, by bringing things to a standstill. And at the same time, look, hypothetically, right, if a police officer killed me, I would probably, in the back of my mind, want the police station to be set on fire because, I don't know if that's an objective thing, but I would certainly feel vindicated, or my ghost would anyway. So look, it is a fine line, and I do think when you have a situation, right, where the police response to a bunch of kids flinging plastic bottles is to lob smoke grenades and disperse the crowd, is that really a proportionate use of force? You know what I mean? You shouldn't be throwing anything at the police, but, I think things should be proportionate. And look, I agree it's not an easy question often. From what I've seen myself, man, like, in a single second, it'll go from being a loud demonstration to someone throwing a garbage can through the window of a shop, or literally flinging around a porta potty. I've seen some shit, literally and metaphorically. And the issue is that when that happens, often the police are nowhere nearby to stop the bad actor. And also, the people there who are calling it out are unable to stop the looters from doing so because they are unarmed and they have no way of doing it. So I can sort of understand the other's perspective, right? Because if you're a police officer, the only way to deal with that situation, if it escalates that far, is to put an end to the gathering for everybody, and until the area has been cleaned out.
Yeah, I think there's some really important points you made there. And I think we've seen disproportionate violence on both sides. And I think there's a real significant issue of the vast majority of protests seem to be peaceful, but you get 15 or 16 opportunistic people or politically motivated people, and you chuck them into a crowd of 3,000, and it becomes that whole 3,000 is suddenly a violent protest, even though 5% would, or even less, would be actually doing anything that you would say is rioting or against the law, and not actually expressing any legitimate political expression. That second part of the question there, Criostoir, I kind of want to throw to you, Dara. Trump has threatened to bring in military services if governors cannot get the state under control. And to do certain acts like this, he would have to do something, enacting something called the Insurrection Act, Dara. So can you give us a little bit of background on this act? And it's my understanding this would not be the first time it's been used.
No, it wouldn't be the first time it was it's been used. It was signed into law by Thomas Jefferson in 1807, and it basically allows the President of the United States to deploy the military or to deploy the troops or the National Guard in order to quell for certain activities, so such as preventing civil disobedience, insurrections, rebellions, these sorts of things. Interestingly enough, it's directly in opposition to another act that expressly prevents the military being used against civilians and domestic problems, basically. So there is a bit of a conflict in there, but it generally prevails if there's enough urgency required. It's been used a number of times throughout history, prior to sort of the early to mid 1900s. It was used mainly to quell labour disputes. So it was used to break up strike actions, labour disputes. It was used against the Ku Klux Klan, believe it or not. And then after that, it was used lots of the time to break up race riots, particularly post the assassination of Martin Luther King. It was used again on a number of occasions. And then the most recent use of it was in 1992. And that was for a similar circumstance in LA, where excessive use of force by the police against a man called Rodney King spurred a bunch of race riots again, and the military was brought in again to try and control that outbreak. So, I mean, there has been a definite history of this being used as a tool to be able to prevent further disruption.
Yeah, and I think you've brought up some really important context there, Dara. And I think a lot of young people, especially Generation Z, anyone under 25, needs to know, to put this into perspective. Also, of course, what's going on is horrific, scary, horrible, but America has a history of these kinds of events. It has been a tumultuous and violent and scary place throughout moments of its history. And that doesn't mean that what's going on right now isn't horrific, but it does allow you to kind of process it better, I think. But also pivoting back to you, Satya, what are your thoughts on the possible use of the Insurrection Act, but also the Trump's response so far?
Yeah, sure. Look, so the important thing to remember is that the Insurrection Act cannot be used in a way that conflicts with the First Amendment, which absolutely protects the freedom to peaceably assemble, the freedom to protest, the freedom of the press, and the freedom of political expression and free speech. It can only be employed or used where there is an actual threat of civil disorder or insurrection, as is in the name. And the government should be very careful about deploying this act, because it can be used as an excuse to cramp down on completely lawful civil protests. And the issue here again is, you also want to be very careful about this sort of thing, because when you cramp down harshly on protests, even when they are sometimes getting out of hand, you run the risk of inflaming tensions even further. There needs to be an avoidance of this perception that it is being used as a way to shut down lawful but inconvenient protests. Because otherwise it can backfire completely. It can just make the public more angry that their concerns aren't being listened to or heard. With that being said, look, we already have a number of technically military people who are part of the police forces. I mean, I'm referring to the National Guard. So National Guard troops, who are the equivalent of the Army Reserves, really, have so far been involved in curtailing some of the protests. Some people are quite uncomfortable with this, but I can say that not all of them have behaved badly. Many of them have been, I think, quite important in preventing things from getting out of hand. The issue isn't so much the use of military police or not. The issue would be the way in which they're used and what they're being used for. And I think given the way things are currently going, there might not be a need for the military to be called in properly under the Insurrection Act.
Oh, that's really good news, I guess, that it does really feel like it's calming down. But leading on to that, I was when I was reading about this and the kind of reforms that we need to look at. I was discussing with Zach this morning. This all comes back to personal responsibility and talking about that, and also you may think of that I'm talking about that where it was that one cop's actions and this all blew up, but also some of the laws that protect cops, because one of the main things I think that was 100% legitimate about these protests, apart from obviously the tragedy, was the delay in bringing that police officer to justice. He hasn't faced court yet, but I think there was a real delay in that process, which made things much worse. And that's because of something called qualified immunity, and also the powerful nature of police unions, which means that there's processes in the way. Satya, do you have any thoughts on that, and what part police unions, which I think have not been brought into this discussion enough, played in this tragedy?
Sure. I mean, I guess before I do that, I just want to, clarify what I've said before. Things are seeming to look up right now. But look, the nature of the beast is that things can change very quickly. There's a thunderstorm happening behind me, which I hope isn't a bad omen. Like I said, on Saturday, there's going to be a huge protest. We're talking levels of attendance comparable to the Women's March. So the odds of something, the odds of chaos returning well and truly to DC are certainly on the cards. To your question, look, qualified immunity is one of those really unjust and insane principles, because it allows police officers to have immunity for very blatant violations of people's civil rights. Some of the terrible cases that we've seen of this being used involve even besides murders by the police, you have the killing of family pets, which pose no threat, a 10-year-old boy who was shot, and over $200,000 was stolen from a civilian, and the police were immune because of qualified immunity. And you also touched on the other important thing, which is that police unions can be notorious. They really have a tendency to protect their own. Reason has written a number of articles, both about how terrible police immunity or qualified immunity is, and how it's being used to shield bad cops, as well as the tendency of police unions to protect their own. The other point to make also is that a lot of the time when you have police misconduct, it is punished by internal affairs or by internal police processes, and they also have a tendency to protect their own. When a better idea is to have civilian oversight, have community members form the oversight committees to judge these disputes, and the conviction rates for police misconduct are much higher when this is the case. The only problem is a lot of these committees that already exist, they can only make recommendations. All the police chief has to say is, nah, not going to happen, and that's it. But I think now with the political movement the way it is, with the public anger, we can hopefully see some big ticket change to the way the system operates.
I think, some really good points there again. But also, we've got a legal student and an illegal researcher here. I also kind of want to hear your thoughts on qualified immunity, Dara, because I do understand why it exists to an extent, because, it's about that you would sue the police, not the individual police officer, which makes sense because as a police officer, you are taking orders. But there are other professions such as doctors, teachers, multiple other professions that have to have private kind of professional insurance themselves to kind of mitigate that. And there just seems to be a double standard. I know that policing is a very difficult profession, but this does seem to be causing some major issues right now. But what are your thoughts?
I think there's a principle in law called vicarious liability. So the actions of the employee are attributable to the employer. So anything that the employee does that is incorrect is presumed to be acting as an agent of the organization they're representing as an employee. I think the qualified immunity is kind of a subset of that, in the sense that there's a valid principle at play that that the police have a very difficult job, particularly in America, where people are generally armed, and there's a lot that can go wrong. It's a very high stakes profession, in the sense that there is definitely a good reason to try and mitigate some of their liability, in the sense that there's a lot of things that could be perceived as excessive, but under the circumstances would perhaps be excusable. But yeah, I think what qualified immunity in US does is actually goes beyond the pale of a legitimate legal protection, and just goes beyond that. So I'm obviously not a US lawyer, so I'm not qualified to make any more remarks apart from that. But yeah, that would be my observation.
Just to quickly add to that, one of the issues that we've seen here in the States is that often you have federal courts that end up prosecuting these cases where qualified immunity is presented as a defense. And often there's a reluctance for them to make rulings that would overrule qualified immunity because no similar case with those sorts of facts has gone through yet. And that makes things difficult. So really, this doctrine, I don't think that any sort of case law or common law remedy is going to help fix the system. It really needs to come down to reforming the way the law actually works, perhaps even getting rid of qualified immunity or making its scope very, very narrow. Because right now, it dates back to the 60s, and it really it needs to be retooled, because since the 60s, we've seen the drastic militarization of the police. We've seen the use of paramilitary tactics, which have often been behind some of the worst instances of abuse. Breonna Taylor, she was an African-American woman. The protesters a few days ago were chanting her name. She died because the SWAT team conducted a no-knock raid and shot the place up and basically killed her. She was completely innocent. These sorts of tactics have only really developed and formed in the years since qualified immunity became a thing. So it's time to revisit the law and perhaps change it to reflect the way things should be. But also we do need to see demilitarization of the police force. There's no need for civilian police forces to be buying military equipment or to be engaging in these sorts of tactics. It doesn't help protect and serve the community. It only erodes public trust. And all the surveys of Americans conducted in the last 10 years have found the same result there.
Yeah, some really good points there. And Anjali, I would also like to hear if you had any thoughts on qualified immunity, but also you have another question to Satya about what's unfolding.
Yeah, absolutely. So in regards to qualified immunity, I would also agree with Dara and Satya there in that compared to, say, vicarious liability as a doctor, there is sort of that life and death decision that a police must make. So there is, I guess, a higher magnitude of risk there. But I do see where the abolition of qualified immunity could enable the police to retain more legitimacy and also dissuade police from abusing their power. So I think there is that tension that does need to be balanced. But in regards to a question that I have for Satya, it's more to do with the internal divisiveness that is occurring in America at the moment, because America's problems aren't intrinsic to liberal individualist societies. But America has been seen as this leader of the free world. So how do you think this affects this US image as an exemplar of individualism and freedom, particularly when its adversaries like China have long upheld authoritarianism as ideologically superior to American democracy and is probably gloating as the US is tearing itself apart?
Yeah, look, I think it's important to keep perspective in mind. And one of the issues with living in countries like ours, which are so incredibly privileged, where you have the kind of rights which are not the norm at all for anyone who lives in most of the world, is that there's a tendency to look on the other side and say the grass is greener, but when it absolutely isn't. It's easy to look at what's happening in America right now and to say, this is chaos, this is horrible, look at China. China's all peaceful, they don't have these problems. When the reality is, look at the price that China has paid for, so-called not having those problems. They committed a massacre of their own citizens who were peacefully assembled in Tiananmen Square. They've had to erase that incident from the historical record completely and brainwash their population. They put dissidents in literal concentration camps and commit ethnic cleansing and genocide. They harvest people's organs. I mean, and what is America by comparison? Well, in America, you have the freedom to go out and protest. Even when the police are being heavy-handed, they're firing tear gas shells at you, and your eyes sting for 10 minutes, and you're out of the area. You don't disappear overnight; your family disappears with you. You have the opportunity to agitate and to demand the change you want to see in your society. And yes, there are riots, from time to time. There are, times of civil and political tension. But this is how a vibrant liberal democracy works. And if you look around the world, the norm for most countries is authoritarianism. And despite that fact, the norm is still, even in these authoritarian countries where the government has so much power, is for there to be a civil war every 20 or 30 years. So we really are privileged to live where we live. And the fact that things are bad at the moment, I think, is, to be honest with you, a sign of the vibrant and thriving country that we have here in the United States, where people come from all sorts of walks of life and can sort out their differences, even if things occasionally do get a little bit ugly.
Yeah, I think that's really important to remember. My husband, who is a historian, constantly says, why do people feel so entitled for the world to be perfect? The world has never been perfect. There's always difficult things, and you're always going to have to face them. But there's this kind of thing right now with, I think social media kind of exacerbates it. It's like this entitled childlike kind of thing of, why isn't the world perfect for me, not perfect for everyone, which I think is a little bit worrying to watch. But I think, Criostoir, you have a very interesting and poignant question for Satya up next that I'd like you to ask.
Yeah, Satya, America does seem like a divided and somewhat angry place right now. Is part of the problem that America is too big for democracy? I know they are actually a republic, but they do use a democratic process, and that requires a certain level of shared interest. Now, there does not seem to be much shared interest between, say, Texas and California right now. So why are they all the one country and voting for the same leader?
It's interesting you say that, because right now, the thing that people were talking about are the number of Californians who are moving to Texas, because California has this horribly high taxing a place now, which has pretty terrible outcomes in terms of social welfare, horrible situation for homeless people and so on, despite the fact that there's so much wealth and, such high taxes and other things and regulations in that place. But the worry is that, blue voters will, vote in blue policies once they move to Texas. So there's a lot of debate going on even within the country about these issues. I think the important thing to remember is that America has always been a federation. It was formed on the understanding that from the very beginning, the states cannot agree on a lot of things and want to do things very differently. Someone in Alabama has very different values to a person in Los Angeles, and giving the states as much say as possible over, how they manage affairs is one of the reasons why the country has been held together. And this is, and the reason why they're able to be one country is because most of the things that influence your daily life are controlled by the states. It's the way that Australia should be, but hasn't been for the last 80 years. And, I run into this problem, right, with a lot of Australians, because our tendency is to say, Donald Trump or whoever it is incompetent and terrible. I mean, for whatever reason, but one of the reasons is he hasn't done enough on this issue or that issue, when I have to say, well, it's a state issue. It's not up to him. He literally does not have the power to handle certain things. It's down to the states. A lot of the coronavirus response, for example, is a state thing, and it's important to keep that in mind. I do think it's important that America stays together as a single entity, because while they might not agree on most things, the Californian or the Texan have a common interest in ensuring the integrity of the union remains, to preserve against threats from the outside. And as we as libertarians, as we say, hashtag the feds, the more power we can take away from the federal government in the areas that it doesn't need to put its nose into. If we can just limit the federal government to doing foreign affairs and defense and a few narrow things like that, I think is a very positive outcome. And it'll ensure that the country can still be held together and different folks can find different solutions for the problems affecting them.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting conversation that has been opened up by these tragic events. in similar conversations about federalism and state rights have been happening in Australia after the COVID-19 response, even though, again, that was a tragedy. At least it is starting to open some conversations up, and it is making people start to realise the power at different levels of government and who has control over what, which I think is really important for the general populace to understand. But for now, I would like to say that I think we'll end the show there, and I would like to thank our 4 guests for today. This is a really heavy and difficult topic, and I think all of them spoke about this with real respect for each other, respect for the topic, and maturity and grace. So I'd like to thank, first off, our international guest, Satya. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you.
And our wonderful campus coordinators, Anjali and Criostoir, and of course, our wonderful IPA researcher, Dara. But for our young audience out there, I really want to make this point to you right now, that I know you may be feeling anxious or scared, and it can get a little bit overwhelming sometimes. I know personally I had some nightmares after watching too much news coverage and being on too much social media this week, watching all this unfold. So know that it's okay to take a break, to step back from social media, step back from the news. Just because you are stepping away doesn't mean that you don't care about justice, you don't care about racial injustice, you don't care about what is going on in America. It just means that you're human and that you have empathy, and you have empathy when you see these things happening to other human people on TV. So take a break, talk with your friends about what you are thinking and feeling, or host your own little viral banter and even forget the politics part. Just look after each other right now. So for everyone listening, please stay safe. Satya, please stay safe and try to stay happy, and please stay free.